Welcome to InfoFire, the fireside chat series from Information Matters. Each episode is a conversation with a guest on a chosen topic. Our guests bring diverse perspectives and some of the hot and happening issues or technologies impacting our information environment. I am Shalini, your host for this series. I am a strong advocate of technology for development. I have undertaken many projects and researched on diverse areas of information sciences, from cognitive to cultural aspects. Many of these projects, from Vidyanidhi Digital Library to Wikigyan, have been multi-partner engagements. The motto of the International School of Information Management that I founded in the year 2005 at the University of Mysore with magnificent grants from the Ford Foundation was interdisciplinarity and partnerships across organizations around the world. In today's episode of InfoFire, I will be chatting with Dr. Carolyn Watters on the topic of Towards Responsible AI, leveraging multi-partner engagement. Let me introduce our guest, Dr. Carolyn Watters. Dr. Watters joined Canada's National Research Council in February 2019 as its inaugural Chief Digital Research Officer on secondment from Dalhousie University and served for 2 years. Dr. Watters, who has a PhD in computer science, served as a professor in the Faculty of Computer Science at Dalhousie University. Her area of specialization is human-computer engagement in information spaces, from documents to social media. She served as the Provost and Vice President Academic for Dalhousie University, one of Canada's oldest research universities from 2010 to 2018. Dr. Watters was one of the founding members of CALDO, a consortium of Canadian research universities to build partnerships with universities in Latin America. She has engaged widely in quality assurance, including a term as chair of the Maritime Higher Education Commission. Her interdisciplinary and collaborative work has spanned all three National Research Funding Councils: the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. She has published over 170 peer-reviewed articles, supervised many PhD and master students, and has engaged in applied research with corporations. She is a role model for women in science and technology, including many years on the founding board of Women Unlimited. She has co-founded a successful spin-off company, now 20 years old, based on developing innovative, interactive mathematics and working with publishers in the digital transformation of learning material. She has been a member of NCERC Discovery Grant Committee, a member of the SSHRC Governing Council, and the Research Council for MyTax. In today's episode, I will be conversing with Dr. Watters on her career and life journey, as well as her passion for responsible AI. Hello, welcome to InfoFire, the fireside chat series from Information Matters. Our guest today is Dr. Carolyn Watters, Professor Emeritus of Computer Science, Dalhousie University, Canada, and who was also till recently the Chief Digital Research Officer, National Research Council of Canada. Hi, Carolyn.
Hello, Shalini.
Welcome to InfoFire.
Thanks for having me.
So the topic of our conversation today is leveraging multi-partner engagement towards responsible AI. Before we get to the topic, Carolyn, I'm sure our audience would like to know a little bit more about your personal journey, how you got to be who you are today. Why did you choose academia? How come you chose computer science? And more importantly, You not only served as a faculty of computer science at Dalhousie University for decades, you also became the provost and then the vice president academic for the last 10 or so years. And then went on to take on leadership roles, even at the National Research Council of Canada. So I'm sure youngsters, especially women, are going to be inspired by your personal story. Please share with us your personal story.
Well, I don't know if it's inspiring, Shalini, but I would say that essentially when there was an opportunity to do something that I thought was worthwhile, I took the chance, people helped, I got it done, and then that opened up new doors. But I'll actually answer your question. So I didn't actually choose computer science. I started out in chemistry and physics because I love to understand how things work. And then I wanted to find a problem and figure out how to fix it. And so after I finished my undergraduate degree, they were just starting programs in computer science in Canada. And I had a friend who said, I think you'd really like this. So not ever having taken any computer science, I don't think I'd even seen a computer. I enrolled in the master's program. Why not? And so that's how I got started in computer science. And it was a fit from the beginning. It sort of had lots of math, it had lots of theory, it had lots of problems. It had a lot to do with how we figured out how to do things with people, for people, by people, that sort of hands-on approach. And then from there, so then I went to Dalhousie as a professor. And it is the perfect job. You get to think about things, you get to argue with colleagues, work with students, great job. However, and I maintain my professor research role throughout everything. But we were trying to put together a new, what was then in the early 2000s called electronic commerce. But to do that, we figured out we needed to have 3 faculties involved. They just had never happened at Dalhousie for sure before. So we had to get the business faculty, the law faculty, and the computer science faculty to agree on the principles, to agree on the courses, change all those rules and regulations about what courses students could take for credit to actually get a degree. And we did get that through and actually gave the course for the government. But it was the first time that we'd actually figured out, we knew where we wanted to go, but how do we get it done? And then that's what got me interested much more in the graduate programs. And so we had a fledgling interdisciplinary PhD program. And so I took the opportunity to go as Associate Dean for Graduate Studies to make that program real. And so that was an exciting opportunity. And then I became Dean. And then out of being Dean of Graduate Studies and working internationally on that, I was given an opportunity to be the stand-in when the previous provost left. And then I thought, well, this is a great job. So I applied and got that job. So that's how I did that. When I finished my second term, I had an administrative leave. And so I was asked by the government if I would come and be be the inaugural, I guess, Chief Digital Research Officer, to try and figure out at the government level, what does digitization mean and how does it affect people and the economy? And so the National Research Council is the one of the research arms of the government. So our space agency was spun out of the National Research Council, and our lovely time signal, which all Canadians will recognize, is run by the National Research Council. But it has this unique mandate to actually enhance scientific knowledge, but at the same time support business innovation in Canadian industry that take up on the new science. And thirdly, science-based information for the government to make better policies so that the benefit is ensued, not just economically by Canadians, but in terms of their social well-being and health, et cetera. So it's a great place for that kind of nexus of how do we make these things work together. And it was during that time that I actually sort of came face to face with this notion of responsible AI and the development in Canada of frameworks and regulations around that. So that's how I got here.
So let's get to responsible AI in a moment. But before that, I have another question to you. So, what aspect of this leadership is it? The problem solving, putting together, multidisciplinary group of people, or is it driving the initiative to drive change that compelled you to or make you like these positions? Which one of them? I'm sure all of them.
I'm sure it's all of it. I think what's really engages me is how do you get the right people at the table to formulate why is there a problem here? What are the principles of the solution that you're driving for? And then figure out the strategy with all these different perspectives at the table. So it's not just my bright idea of the day. It's sort of a collective. And when you get those different perspectives at the table, you start to think about the problem differently. And the principles will evolve differently, which means that, the strategy to get those principles done will be more inclusive and less, let's just hand it to the developer and then we'll do whatever the program says at the end. Like how do we manage that over cycles of time so that you don't build it and put a cement wall around it. You build it, you assess it, you audit it, you change it, right? But you have to have the different perspectives. And for me, that's sort of an interesting thing because you know yourself as an academic, you work with your students, but largely it's in your own head. And you have to get out of that space. So I don't know if that answers it, Shalini.
Yeah, so now let's get to the main theme of our conversation today, responsible AI. Could you just explain to our audience what you mean by responsible AI? Does it mean that AI is not responsible otherwise? I'm just asking a question. And what are the key principles and issues? What forces led to? Are there problems which led to people thinking about responsible AI?
Right. So let me just I'm going to give a little primer. That's okay. I'm sure all the audience knows this, but just to make sure we're all clear.
Yeah.
So artificial intelligence to me is the simulation of human intelligence. So it's mimicking what we do. There's this whole notion of augmented intelligence, which means that we use our algorithms to complement it, to work with human intelligence, give us the right stuff at the right time so we can make better decisions. But the decisions are made by people. So it's sort of more of a hybrid. Machine learning is really just an algorithm. It's part of AI. It's really not a separate thing. It's one of the tools that AI uses. And then responsible AI, if we kind of lump all that stuff in the same bag, responsible AI for me is around building frameworks based on human principles of accountability, right? So this accountability, when we write programs, we're not too worried about accountability. We want the thing to work. We want it to come out with the answer, right? We want it to do it efficiently in a timely manner. We don't want a whole lot of bugs in it. But actually, who's accountable, right? And how do we show that the users of this, that they understand the accountability? Who's actually accountable for the decisions, for example? So that framework and having framework, once you have a framework, then you can think about compliance. You can think about what are the regulations that governing bodies need to have in place so that the responsibility isn't just the programmer, it's how it's used, how it gets in the economy, how it affects poor people, how it affects women, right? All the way up and down. So there are a number, and I'll no doubt mention a few as we go along, but they all kind of overlap in terms of the principles. And so I would say in terms of the responsible part of AI, the first thing is this transparency. Can the people who are affected by these algorithms, can they understand what it is? So if you make a decision and I come to you and say, Shalini, that doesn't make sense, you can explain to me, what for, what against, and how you made your decision. You can't really go to the little 1 million line code and say, could you explain to me why this is 6 and not 7? And the second principle of
the interpretability of the AI, right?
Exactly. So that people understand that it's transparent. It's not just just do what I say. I can understand how you got there. At some level, you don't want to be done at the code level, but at some level. The second is this whole notion of equity and fairness. Who benefits from this, right? So so equity is more that, so who benefits? What data was used, right? Was it fair? Did it come out of this from are all people represented, or just the people that you want to sell something to, right? And is it fair? Does it allow access for people who currently we've got people in Canada and everywhere who don't have enough bandwidth, who don't actually understand how to use. In fact, sometimes I don't understand how to use all my devices to get stuff done. So that kind of equity, fairness, it's not discriminating against people because of something that was biased in the algorithm of the data. And of course, the notions of safety and security and privacy, I think, really come to a head here when we have things being done at light speed, huge amounts of data, which we don't know much about, and making decisions. So how secure is our data? How safe are we when we're in an automated system? How safe is that actually? So physically and data-wise. And the last part, and the thing that I really think is really important, is this notion of governance. How do we actually come to grips with governing a world that's driven by gazillion line algorithms? This is really important because as we rely more and more on the algorithm, then, who's governing? Who's actually making sure that it's assessing it, that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, especially because, as we know, it has to be maintained and updated continually. There are always little bugs, people fixing it, people have some new bright idea. There's, 5G, 29G, whatever G we're at. That changes what we can do. And when quantum comes into this, we're going to need some serious governance and understanding of the play between the quantum pieces and the current technologies. Like, how do they work together? Because at that point, it's pretty difficult to be transparent. So we better have a way of governing the way this benefits people and what they need to be doing, as opposed to just algorithms going on. It's like an old HGLs and all that. Right? So those are my principles.
Okay. So let us take one of them first. For me, of course, naturally, equity is an important issue. So, when computers came into the picture way back, let's say even 30, 40 years back also, everyone was gung-ho about it and said that, no, this is going to kind of, to some extent it did, made the field a level playing field for many people. From north-south divide to poor people, etc. So, and it's true of even, well, when you see things happening today, you still, at least I still feel it's always a case of rich getting richer. See, you are already, let us say, when I say rich, I don't mean only in terms of economic richness, okay? One could be rich, but, one doesn't know how to use computer or internet, etc., will not be able to leverage. Of course, as a faculty or as a teacher, I always have this, crib with my students. Even when we did not have word which would highlight the errors, spelling errors, I'm saying, we had to do it, using dictionary, etc. Even today, I see people not even bothering to check the red lines and then doing. That means, unless you pay attention, and also unless, you know that is important or what it says, you're still not leveraging the benefits of the technology. So rich get richer, or I would say, how do you, I use that expression in the sense of escape velocity. How do you escape from these things? It still pulls you down. Either you have to have the motivation to do it, or you have to have the background to leverage the technology, all of that, right? So do you think that responsible AI would bring in better changes?
I don't know if AI will, But I think the notion of responsible frameworks, governance with compliance, and governance that includes how do we ensure, just like we ensure as much as possible that everybody can read and write, that everybody actually understands they have a responsibility of their own to understand where that data is coming from and how they can push back, right? So, you know, in India and in Canada for sure, you know, it's important that people understand they can push back against big business. In this case, big programs. So the way that I look at leveling the playing field is, first of all, this really depends a lot on equalizing access to data. So as you know, I've been to India many times, and the first time I went, nobody had a cell phone. There were only a couple of computers in Bangalore, so that dates me. And then about 10 years later, when I was back doing something else, everybody had a cell phone. I could get a cell phone on any street corner, a rupee a minute anywhere. And I thought, holy mackerel, that changes the ballgame entirely. Because it was cheaper for me to get a phone in India. I could call anybody. Couldn't do that in Canada. But, you know, it changes. But it's not just everybody having a cell phone. We need to make sure that the connectivity is good enough that they can use it, that they can do online courses, that they can do online banking, right? So that it's fast enough, it has enough capacity, and it's cheap enough that it becomes what used to be electricity or a regular old phone somewhere. And if we don't have that equal access, then of course the people who can afford to have 16 cell phones and 2 mini tabs, they're going to be using and getting value out of this much more than the people. So, and you know, there are lots of studies showing that homeless people need to have a cell phone because otherwise they don't have an address. So how can you apply for a job if nobody can contact you, right? So, you know, that's leveling the playing field. And the other, and I think this is equally important in the notion of how does government plan this, what's the distribution of the rewards of these systems? So we have a new economy that's building and largely driven by AI, the digital world. But who actually gets the benefit of this? 5 companies, 10 companies, new companies. People get benefit from this, except for now they have to have high-speed internet, have to have an address so the delivery truck can come, right? It gets expensive, actually. It changes the economy. But I think this notion of distributing the new wealth is kind of like the early 1900s in North America, where you had, you know, one group owned all the railroads, one group owned all of the manufacturing, right? And then everybody was working for just minimum wage. They weren't getting really a big benefit from this. And it sort of leveled out. And now I think there's a danger that we fall back into that where we have really disadvantaged groups. And I think part of this is what I would call equity in terms of employment and education. So it's not that everybody's pretty much educated, but how do we get those skills and training that mean these higher level jobs? So even in computer science, you know, you don't want to just be a programmer forever. How do we get those skills in there that they can program advanced AI, advanced machine learning, data, all the data science things that your programs and our programs are just booming. But how do we get that? How do we get that to a much broader spectrum of the population? So not just like me, the nerdy kids who went to university, but people in arts and people, you know, welding and, you know, a much broader stroke. And in Canada, Indigenous people and our racially visible people, how do we get them in these and make employment equitable in the home? And finally, I really think that the data sets we use are flawed. and they get more and more biased because it's typically a data set of convenience. We have the data, so we run it through our algorithm. It's not the algorithm's fault, really. It's that we continue to use convenient data. So how do we actually step back and think about what's the data that we need to ensure that this is not biased, and then regularly audit that we're continuing to do that. So that's my rant on fairness.
No, it's good that you brought the discussion or conversation to the bias issue, because whatever we try to do, whether it's software or AI or algorithms, etc., the fundamental issue here is that machines are learning from the data, as you mentioned. Of course, we all know that. But how do we ensure that the underlying reason is the human bridging, right? That is something that needs to be addressed, and that cannot be done, to some extent with data, some extent with governance, as you said. But are there any other ways you can, because we have seen with whether it is facial recognition or even, for example, health parameters. Like many a times, some of these parameters that are used, they say it is, like say if it is North America, it's based on primarily, let us say, white population, whereas it could vary for, Black population, right? The parameters could vary. Similarly, there could be variations between, let us say, the Caucasians and the Asians. So I'm concerned about health parameters also, for example. There is that bias. Because we have the data, okay, you say that this is the, whatever, above this is, I'm just using this word, above this is diabetes and below this is not diabetes, correct? So that parameter itself is based on data set, which is essentially the dominant data set that is used there.
Right. Yeah, so the great example, of course, is all the original heart attack studies were done for middle-class males. And then 20 years later, somebody thought, oh, women have heart attacks too, but none of these results, they're not parameters for them. So I always keep that one in mind, because it didn't matter, how you got there. And they did that for years. So I think, Shalini, I think for me, it's at the beginning. You have to think about this at the beginning. I think the worst thing people can do is drop a bunch of specs and hand them over to a developer. Because all developers, just like you and me and everybody, we have some built-in ways that we have been trained to think about things. And we don't always look at the broader perspective. I have a very Canadian view. It's always chilly, and so make sure you got heat. And so you think, oh, well, yes, in fact, there are people living on the street here. How does this impact them? They don't have that's when I started thinking about, well, they need to have phones, right? So then they can get a job, right? Can't get a job, can't get a phone. So, we have these little curtains, and we think we're looking through them, but often we're sort of, but not quite. So I think it's this intentionality at the beginning. When we say let's say we're going to have driverless cars or whatever. And so we need to put together, significant perspectives before we come up with what we're doing. And so I think, and I mean fairly broad, so we need the developers, of course, but we need social advocates, and we need researchers on social issues. We actually need to have at the table representing the companies that are going to put this in place, so they hear and they contribute. So it's how many voices do we have at the table? And we need citizen advocacy voices, not just one, but I can't speak for India, but in Canada, you can think of about 10 perspectives that need to be there. And you need to listen. Everybody needs to be listening. And you need the policymakers there at the beginning, so they can begin to understand what are the regulations around this? Where does the government need to draw some some firm lines. And what does compliance look like? And what is it you're promising to do anyway? Can we tax it? Right? You know, can we tax and distribute the wealth? Like, I don't know what policy, other things, policy makers, but a lot of these inequity things end up, you want them to end up in policy. And so you want them to be seen at the table at the beginning. And of course, you need the governments. So the local, in Canada, we have provinces and at the federal level. But because the government is a client to many of the biggest AI things, health and economy, like space, you know, the big developers of AI programs. And because they're big, they're the ones who should be at the table saying, are the rights of individuals and of communities respected by this new system we're putting in? Whose economic interests are the economic interests of different kinds of peoples in Canada? Are they being respected and helped? What are the ethics of the security and the privacy? How do we look at that as a broader scope? And how does this impact on our promises for sustainability in the world and in the country? So they've got a whole different thing. But their most important things, I would think, would be as a regulator. What is the framework? What do we have to put in place? How do we get agreement? How do we make sure that we don't look at it in 20 years? It's got a 3-year cycle, and we look at it and we test. What are the assessment parameters? What happens if somebody goes completely amok? What's our legal system saying? Is there a whole new set of laws we need? Because now you can't blame the algorithm. You can only blame, I'm not sure who you blame. You can't really just blame the programmer, right? So who makes that decision? And if it's done in code, who's responsible for the decision? And of course, at least in Canada, the governments at the 2 levels of government are responsible for a huge amount of the funding of research. So the government needs to be at the table along with policymakers and people. But I think that's the way that we actually change the playing field here. And if we want to be responsible, we have to be not just talking about what it means to be fair, but we have to be enacting what it means to be fair.
So yeah, I mean, so in a way, what you're saying or suggesting is, end of the day, it is the policy frameworks, the governance, the regulatory framework that kind of bring in the change in a desired manner or a direction that we would like to have, whether it is the equity issue or the bias issue. It can somehow be managed not by the algorithm or the technology, but by the governance factor, right? That's true. But sometimes, you know, the government itself, I mean, I'm just now talking about in general, not the AI part of it, but general digital technology, including the AI, the surveillance issue, for example. So you need to have the government doing this, but sometimes that could be kind of what you would call as the oversight itself could result in a problem.
Yes, of course. And that's why you need, I think, sort of this notion of recognizing this is evolving. This is not a one and done, right? And the government itself has to be transparent on this. So when it's election time, or when you have committees, this is something that needs to be discussed, and how well did you do last time, right? And I think that we can only have a discussion if we have all the voices at the table and they understand they're being heard. If the climate is such that people talk, but nobody ever listens, right? Nothing ever changes, then we stop talking, right? You only have so much energy. Where are you going to put it? And if there isn't any chance of changing it, then people will figure out on their own at a different level how to protect themselves from intrusive AI. That's not good either, because it's going to be there.
Yeah. So talking about the government, other one, of course, it's not just the government I'm kind of generally, maybe it's my personal worry, I would say the autonomous weapon systems, autonomous driving. I mean, autonomous driving is now fairly, is already in. What about the autonomous weapon systems? Because each government, country is, I mean, especially now we are talking in the midst of the Ukraine war. Of course, once there was this nuclear issue, now there is also the issue of autonomous systems.
Yeah,
I know it is scary, but I think we will not get there, but just generally, what?
yeah,
Because that's again AI, right?
yeah, I think that where we're at is we need to rethink the politics of war. I mean, this is just me speaking, I'm not speaking for anybody else, because we're at a state where, although people clearly get killed, the weapons are not. There's little risk to the person employing the automatic weapon. And so the notion of, I think as a collective of, 7 billion people, we better come up with a different way of resolving disputes, or there's going to be a really nasty. It doesn't take very much to really change the whole quality of life for everybody, not just the people who are arguing over A, B, or C. And, this is not my area at all, but I think that we need to step back and be adults. Figure out how to do this in a different way.
One other area that I read about the NRC and its work in this algorithmic impact assessment. How is it framed and used? Algorithmic impact assessment.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Algorithmic impact and assessment. So they have now framed algorithmic impact assessment. Is there something about that NRC has taken up or is doing?
No, I think we're not quite there. Like Canada has done a lot of work in the last 3 years on frameworks, the Montreal Declaration of Responsible AI, the whole notion of the Canadian, there's a regulation, I think I have the name here somewhere. Just a second here. I had it here. Canadian Federal Directive on Automated Decision Making.
Yeah.
So to sort of think what the framework would like, and they're coming out with sort of regulations that outline what you have to answer if you're going to do something in that area.
Yeah.
These are the factors, and so we're not quite at that level but there are several research councils for the Canadian government, and NRC is sort of the largest, and we're mainly in science, but then you start to think about how do you actually implement that, in terms of systems. So you can imagine the levels of security of systems in a government. Yet research has to be kind of unfettered. It's in the middle of something that needs to be fettered. So when you get things like responsible AI, how do you actually work through that? And I would say in the next 2-3 years, this is going to just become something that's the way people do business. Like, you start to think about that first. But if we don't think about it early on in the game, it's too late. You can't be fair at the end of the game. You can be fair when you set up the rules.
So in your view, this is my final question. We are coming to the end of our 30-minute window that we have. So do you think that national governments and businesses are doing enough at building better governance of AI policies and strategies? Can you share some examples?
Do I think they're doing enough? Well, clearly not. I think that people are beginning to really understand. I think a lot of this is driven actually by social advocacy and academic researchers, particularly, and now that there's much closer alignment with this humanities and social sciences and science and computer science people are starting to realize that this is more than just coming up with models and implementing them, this actually has an impact and we can make things better. I think that businesses are a little harder because they just have this, imperative that they can't just spend money and not make money. I think that's kind of universal. But so how do you make it part of their ethos that they need to dig down and make sure that what they're producing is actually going to be fair and equitable? And I think that the recent experience over the last few years with Twitter and social media, Facebook, these things are all of a sudden, people are waking up, whoa, there's a nasty side to this. It can be used for nastiness. It's not just, hello, how are you stuff. Or, a lot of good work has been done in terms of looking at Twitter in particular to kind of gauge optimism and pessimism in different kinds of people, children, their use of language, whether or not women find some solidarity there. Yet there's this great potential. So how do we, while we're building those systems, how do we build in systems that kind of have pre-thought the other, like when you're playing chess, you're not just thinking about your move, you're always thinking about what the other person's going to do. So and that's part of education, it's part of transparency, that we begin to, all of us understand. And then when you know what questions to ask the company before you install or sign up for it. There's nothing like a 25-page, do you agree with this, terms of agreement? Well, I don't know about you, but I only read like a third of it. And my eyes glaze over and I agree. So how do we actually make sure that we do that? I think that we don't have enough governance. It's not deep enough and it's not timely enough at this point. But I do think that certainly since 2018, the world is starting to wake up to the fact that this is another one of our responsibilities. It's our responsibility to try and make sure everybody's fed and everybody gets an education around the world. It's our responsibility to make sure that the AI systems that provide great benefit aren't at the same time destroying social fabric. So I would say, so yes and no.
I know. Thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing your journey and your thoughts on this very important and critical topic of responsible AI. Have a nice day. See you sometime somewhere soon.
Yes, thank you, Shalini. It was great. I really, it's a topic, as you can see, I have some passion for. So, and good luck with the rest of your fireside chats.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.